are the top 10 creatures that you need to kill immediately. Find out next on Commander Replay. So today we're going to be talking about the top 10 creatures that you need to kill immediately in a game of Commander, otherwise you're probably going to lose if you don't. So how did I come up with this list? Well, I very unscientifically compiled a list of creatures that, when they stay in play too long, they usually win the game. And then I cross-referenced that for things that show up commonly, so there may be creatures that are just downright nastier than some of the things on this list, but don't necessarily show up all that often. So I think this list does a really nice job of combining the things that are usually going to end the game and show up very often in games of Commander. So, removal, the main way to kill creatures in a game of Commander. So at the top we see our instant speed removal, and at the bottom we see our sorcery speed board wipes. A lot of the creatures on this list, especially as we get towards the bottom, you're gonna need to use instant speed removal on these things because you may not untap on your turn if you don't. Let's start with some honorable mentions. We see 3 fantastic creatures right here. Butcher of Malakir, really good at making sure other players don't have creatures in play, so if your plan involves having creatures on the board, Butcher of Malakir is something that you're going to need to get rid of. Next up we have Sire of Stagnation, a card that I think is heavily underplayed. I mean, it's like 2/3 of a Consecrated Sphinx, a card that shows up later on this list, and if you leave this thing around for a couple turns, it will win the game. And then finally we have Seedborn Muse, which just generates insane amounts of mana. Opponent does need to be able to use it at instant speed, but they built their deck in a way to be able to take full advantage of that. So don't you worry about that. They'll have plenty of places to park their mana. And honestly, for me, Seedborn Muse should probably be higher on this list, but straight up, I just ran out of spaces in the top 10, but it is very nasty, and I recommend that you kill it immediately. Number 10, Addison, Angel of Hope. Addison does a couple really interesting things. The first thing that I find interesting with Addison is that she's basically this huge brick wall. It's an 8/8 flying indestructible, which means it's so incredibly difficult to attack profitably into an Addison. A token army might be able to do it, but you're going to lose at least one, if not more if they don't have more creatures out. But the main idea is that because it's not profitable, you're probably just not going to attack into the Addison opponent, and their life total is going to stay at whatever it's at for the rest of the game, or at least until someone gets rid of that Addison. Next, the fact that it's an 8/8 flying vigilance means that they're going to be getting in for at least 8 damage every turn. And being that it's white, it's not too hard to get double strike onto it, so you lay a True Conviction into play, and now you're talking 16 with lifelink, on top of the fact that it's a ginormous brick wall, which means that you're not going to be able to get the damage back into them. But then finally, the thing that gets Addison onto this list, all permanents you control have indestructible, which means that most board wipes do not affect your permanents. And one of the fastest ways to win a game of Commander is a one-sided board wipe. If everyone else loses all of their stuff, while the Addison player keeps all of their stuff, it's very easy to attack into undefended opponents. And it's interesting too in that it can be the player with the Addison playing the board wipe, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. So as soon as anyone lays down a board wipe that says destroy, if someone doesn't use like a Swords to Plowshares on that Addison while that thing's on the stack, that Addison player is very close to winning the game. Now, how much time do I think you have to get rid of an Addison that you see on board? In the mid game, you probably still have a couple turns. As long as no one plays the board wipe directly afterwards, you should be fine for like a turn or two. But where it really turns into a game winner is once that board wipe hits. So as you get later into the game and it's easier for someone to go Addison and board wipe in the same turn, then you're talking about something that you need to get rid of on the spot. Number 9. The Titan Cycle. So the Titans are just like the perfect creatures for Commander. Time and time again, I find that they are generally the best creatures in their converted mana cost slots in their colors, and usually by a pretty large margin. The very common play of going Titan, trigger, equip Lightning Greaves, attack, second trigger, all in the same turn, makes these things generate insane amounts of value. Personally, I think Sun Titan is probably the strongest of the group, because even if a player's only getting lands with Sun Titan, they're going to have so many lands in play that they're just going to be able to cast way more things than you ever will. Then also take into account they could be getting things like swords, and Phyrexian altars, and any number of other things that can ruin your day. So you really don't want Sun Titan sticking around very long in a game, because it just generates crazy amounts of value. Next up, Inferno Titan. red players probably know this, but non-red players maybe not as much. That damage trigger from Inferno Titan is ridiculous, especially if you're getting multiple combat steps in a turn, if you're giving it haste, anything like that. You can clear out a lot of blockers, you can shoot people in the face, you can take down planeswalkers, a lot of utility in being able to burn out tons and tons of targets, and you can fire breathe that thing, so if you're just trying to alpha strike away, pumping 2 or 3 extra mana into an Inferno Titan can get you over the hump. So very, very good, and probably needs to be played just a little bit more than it is. Next up is Grave Titan. Grave Titan is just one of my personal favorite win conditions in black. It just makes swarms and swarms of zombies, and over the course of a couple turns, those zombies will kill you. Like, it just generates so many creatures. And then finally, the most underplayed of the cycle, I think, is Frost Titan. Frost Titan is really good in like a tempo control deck, where you're not necessarily trying to get there quickly, but that ability to tap down permanents and make them not on tap is really, really good. You probably have the longest amount of time to react to the Frost Titan as opposed to the other Titans, but also consider that it's blue and there's probably some counter spells backing it up. So how long do you have to get rid of the Titans before they're really a problem? In my opinion, I would say the first trigger is good, the second trigger is really good. I think when you start talking about that third trigger is where you start really seeing problems from the Titans. So obviously get rid of them as quickly as you can, but if you're sitting on something sorcery speed, I would definitely look to get rid of these things before they can get their third trigger off with them, because that's where you start getting into the really crazy amounts of value territory. Number 8. Lighthouse Chronologist. This one seems to show up a little bit less than some of the other really good mono blue creatures. It is a little bit mana intensive. But once you get it leveled all the way up, for each turn your opponents take, you will take an additional turn. Now, in the early to mid game, it's not super likely that opponents are going to have the mana to be able to level this thing up. They will need a mana doubler to do that. Whenever you see a mana doubler, you should probably blow the mana doubler up anyway. So in a sense, that's a little bit self-policing. Now, as the game goes on a little bit, they may be able to get this thing down all in one turn and get it leveled all the way up. And that's where you're really going to want to be careful once the blue player has lots and lots of mana. Lighthouse Chronologist does give you a little bit of time to react to it in that sense. Obviously, instant speed removal is going to be the best against Lighthouse Chronologist, but if you need to wait for sorcery speed to get rid of it, I would say that you want to get rid of this thing before it gives its controlling player a second additional turn. 1 additional turn is good, but not necessarily backbreaking. 2 is very good on the edge of backbreaking. 3 additional turns from that player is going to be absolutely backbreaking. So get rid of this thing as soon as possible, but definitely before the second or third additional turn. Number 7. The Praetor Cycle. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, no one plays Urabrask, and it kinda sucks. But let's go through a thought experiment real quick. Urabrask essentially has 2 abilities from cards that are very, very scary, rolled into one. And that'd be Lightning Greaves and Authority of the Consuls. Lightning Greaves, if someone plays a big monster, gives it haste, swings your way, you die. Authority of the Consuls, someone has a big monster, you try to play blockers, they come in tapped, you die. Urabrask has both of these abilities. So, Urabrask is super underrated in my opinion, and something that I'm going to delve into a little bit more in the future. But the main idea here is that I don't want you guys to misevaluate an Urabrask that's on the board. It's still a legendary Praetor, and it will do bad things to you. Looking at the other Praetors on this list, the 2 most commonly played in my experience are Elesh Norn and Shieldred, and while each of the Praetors is strong in their own way, I think that Shieldred and Elesh Norn are the 2 that you probably have the most amount of time to respond to. Elesh Norn will depend heavily on what creatures are in play for the Elesh Norn player and for other players. Shieldred is also going to depend pretty heavily on what's in play, but also what's in that opponent's graveyard. If they go for something like a Runescarred Demon, you're probably in trouble, but if they go for something more value-based, you may have an additional turn or 2 to be able to deal with the Shieldred. So Elesh Norn and Shieldred will probably allow you the most amount of time to respond to them, which may be like, you may get 1 turn to respond to them at sorcery speed. By the time you start talking like 2 or 3 turns, they'll probably get pretty out of hand. Urabrask by itself isn't necessarily the scariest, but it's the things that start to follow it. So in the mid game, you'll probably have 1 turn to untap and deal with Urabrask. In the late game, if they go Urabrask big creature, then you're probably in trouble. Now, Jin-Gitaxias and Vorinclex are the 2 that I actually see the least of, but these are the ones that you need to get rid of immediately. The thing that Vorinclex does with your mana is awful, and that itself can make you lose a game, so Vorinclex is the type of thing that you really want instant speed removal on. When Vorinclex is on the stack, you should float the mana to instant speed blow that thing up, because your opponents are probably going to go a turn ahead of you if you tap out 4, 5, or 6 mana into a Vorinclex. Jin-Gitaxias, the one that I see least, but also super nasty. If you can blow this thing up before your opponent draws 7, that is really heavily recommended. But if you can't, you better blow it up before your own end step, because you're gonna lose your hand, and it's gonna be really tough to win the game after that. Number 6, Void Winnower. Void Winnower has to be one of the most impactful creatures in a game of Commander, because it says that opponents basically can't play half their spells, and can't block with half their things. Void Winnower is like pseudo-indestructible, because a lot of the board wipes that you would use to get rid of it are 4 and 6 mana. Now, Void Winnower does not necessarily kill you the fastest, but because it's resilient to a lot of different types of removal, it does have a tendency to just stay in play and just keep bashing away until everyone's dead. So Void Winnower just creates absolute havoc for the board and prevents you from being able to cast many of the things in your deck. So if you have a Swords to Plowshares, definitely spend it on a Void Winnower. This thing will take over the game. Number 5, the legendary Eldrazi. I used to think that the Annihilator Eldrazi were the best of the group, but I've really started to come around on Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, because there's always 2 permanents that you need to get rid of in play, and then you start exiling their library, which means that if they don't have the thing they need in play to deal with it, they're probably not going to find it. Annihilator 4 is enough to take a player out of the game. Like, it doesn't straight out kill them, but now they're so far behind that they can't win. Every once in a while, you'll be able to see a token opponent withstand an Annihilator trigger, but by the time a second Annihilator trigger hits, that's really bad. Even if you had a lot of tokens, it's still difficult to survive past a second Annihilator trigger. Emrakul the Promised End I find to be really good against control decks and combo decks, because those are the type of people that are holding a lot of things in their hand typically, and you can just completely mess them up with that Emrakul trigger. And it's a 13/13 flying trample. It does not take too long for that to kill a player. Kozilek Great Distortion, probably the weakest of the bunch, but when you remember that it has Menace and that it's a 12/12 that can be really hard to block, and every once in a while that counterspell mechanic is also relevant. So each of these can all kill you in their own way, and they generally have some sort of resilience to some type of removal or another, which does make them really hard to deal with because you need specific answers for them. So both Ulamogs are indestructible, which means you're probably going to need a Swords to Plowshares or a Reality Shift. Emrakul, interestingly, has protection from instants, so those 2 things not going to work. And if you target the player that had the removal in hand, you can get rid of that as you see fit. Kozilek Butcher of Truth is the least protected of the bunch, but Kozilek the Great Distortion, that counterspell mechanic can potentially stop anything that would try to get rid of that Kozilek. So these things, all big and nasty, they all have on-cast triggers, which means that even if you blow up the creature, they're still getting some kind of value one way or another. Kill these things immediately, even better if you can prevent them from being cast, because once they're cast, it's probably too late. Number 4, Gisela Blade of Gold Knight. So as the Boros player, I love me some Gisela. So Gisela is a really interesting card. The thing that makes Gisela interesting is incentive. Because damage is doubled to opponents and halved to you, it sort of also creates that brick wall effect similar to Addison, where it's just so hard for someone to attack into you profitably. I have held off Avenger of Zendikar armies because it wasn't worth it for them to attack into me with a bunch of tokens that were all going to get their damage halved. So they go kill the other 2 players at the table, and then you only have 1 player left to deal with, and you have a ginormous flying creature that can end the game very easily. And so here's where it gets kind of crazy, is that when someone lays down a Gisela, the next player to untap is going to get a really big shot to do a lot of damage to the other opponents at the table. If you're the 3rd or 4th person in line to untap after that Gisela comes down, oh boy, I hope you're holding up some answers because things are going to be tough for you. So with Gisela, it's interesting that it's not necessarily the Gisela or the Gisela player that are going to do the killing. It's the other players at the table because of all the damage incentive. And then of course remember that Boros is really good at giving haste and giving double strike. Once all that happens, then Gisela can just take you right out of the game. So definitely worth some spot removal on Gisela, if nothing else, just to prevent the damage incentive that gets created for all of your other opponents. Number 3, Consecrated Sphinx. Oh man, Consecrated Sphinx. Play Consecrated Sphinx, pass the turn, draw 2 cards. So I think the focus is, how many cards can a player draw with Consecrated Sphinx before it's really a problem? Drawing 2 cards? Pretty good. Drawing 4 cards, really good. I think by the time you get to 6 cards is probably now broken back territory. If the player who casts Consecrated Sphinx untaps with it, oh man, I mean, the game's probably over for you. They've just drawn so many cards. Unless you too have also drawn many cards, I don't know that you're going to be able to keep up with all the cards they've just drawn. And so if they untap with it, that means that no one has removal because someone would have already played removal on it, which means it's going to keep going for many more turns, drawing many more cards. By the time they get to 6 additional cards, that is a very tough mountain to climb. Any more than that, they are going to be so heavily favored to win the game. And again, we're talking about blue, so that opponent's probably going to be looking to hold up counterspells to protect that Consecrated Sphinx. So it is a card that you need to get rid of immediately, and even just by the time that they untap with it, that's probably too much for the rest of the table to overcome. Number 2, Avenger of Zendikar. I would venture a guess that Avenger of Zendikar has ended more games of Magic than probably any other creature. And if Consecrated Sphinx probably kills you if they untap with it, Avenger of Zendikar certainly kills you if the Avenger player untaps with it. Most people will usually get at least one landfall trigger on the turn that the tokens come into play, and then 1 or more landfall triggers when they untap with it. And I find that usually once they get to 3 landfall triggers, those tokens are enough to kill at least 1 or 2 players at the table, if not everyone. Now, the majority of the time, you will have a chance to respond at sorcery speed, which is good, but occasionally you will see things with Craterhoof Behemoth or Haste from Concord at Crossroads and things like that, where you're not going to get the opportunity to respond at sorcery speed. And that's really where you're going to want instant speed removal. Ideally, the best time to get rid of this thing is while the trigger to create the tokens is on the stack, so that way opponent doesn't get any of the landfall triggers, because if the tokens stay as O1s, they don't do nearly the same thing as when they start getting pumped up. Surviving 1 attack from an Avenger of Zendikar and its tokens is possible, but unlikely. But I don't know that I've ever seen a game survive past 2 attacks with an Avenger of Zendikar army. If the tokens stay in play with counters, I think you're talking about a pretty hard 2-turn cap from that point on. Number 1, Palintron. So if you're a combo player that's interested in a lot of mana, which many combo decks are, Palintron is one of the premier win conditions to generate that mana. Now, one of the issues with Palintron is that, again, you're talking about blue decks, probably going to be some counter spells, and 2, is that once you see the Palintron, it's probably too late. It's unlikely that a player is going to run a Palintron down there unprotected, and without the 4 mana up to return it to their hand. So you'd probably need like 2 pieces of instant speed removal to get rid of it. So yeah, Palintron wins games. I don't know that I've ever seen a Palintron that didn't win a game. I don't know that I've ever seen a Palintron get shot down. And 100%, once you see that Palintron, you will not be untapping in that game. So you need to get rid of that thing immediately, counter it, play a sudden spoiling, do something, because if you don't, the game's probably about to be over. And by about to be over, I mean that that opponent's going to take like a 20-minute turn first before it's actually over. So yeah, Palintron is my number 1. If you see this thing, you need to shoot it, because the game's probably about to be over, but in all likelihood, the blue player has anticipated you trying to shoot it down anyway, so it's probably going to take everyone at the table holding up instant speed removal to prevent that from happening. We have a bonus round! Who is the bonus creature? Well, very similar to Palintron is Laboratory Maniac. If you see the Laboratory Maniac, it's already too late, because the way that the Lab Maniac win works is that usually the opponent has their entire deck in their hand, which means that they're going to have any number of regular or free counter spells to protect that Laboratory Maniac. While it's theoretically possible to shoot down that Laboratory Maniac with the draw trigger on the stack, I've never actually seen it happen. So yeah, when you see the Laboratory Maniac, it's probably too late. You probably needed to do something differently earlier in the game to even prevent the game from getting into the state that it's in now. And that's actually the reason that I didn't include it as part of the 10 itself, is because once you see it, it is definitely too late. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at the top 10 creatures you need to kill immediately in a game of Commander. There were certainly a ton of other creatures that could have made the list but just didn't have room for. What creatures did you guys want to see in the top 10? And of course, I had to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Videos like this wouldn't be possible without them. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below. And as always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.